17 newspaper reports, 17 accession numbers that should exist, 17 entries the ledger does not contain. Between 1880 and 1910, newspapers across the American Midwest and South published accounts of unusually large human skeletal remains discovered during agricultural excavations, railroad grading, and the disturbance of burial mounds. The accounts appeared in local papers, the kind that covered farm news, county politics, and the occasional archaeological curiosity. Many described the remains as having been sent, or scheduled to be sent, to the Smithsonian Institution for examination. Before we go further, a necessary stop. The claim that the Smithsonian deliberately destroyed evidence of a race of giants in order to suppress an alternative history of humanity is not what this video is about. That claim is not supported by any verified primary source. The existence of newspaper reports describing large bones is real. The conclusion that those bones proved the existence of a giant race and that the Smithsonian conspired to hide them is speculation. And speculation of a specific kind that this channel does, not present as fact. What does exist in the documentary record is a narrower and more specific question. What is the relationship between 19th century newspaper accounts of unusual skeletal finds and the Smithsonian's accession record for the same period? That question has a documentable answer. The answer is not conspiratorial, but it is not as simple as either the conspiracy theorists or the institutional dismissals suggest. The accession ledger is the evidence, and the ledger has gaps. Here is what the Smithsonian's accession system actually was, and what it was designed to do. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology, established in 1879, was the federal agency tasked with the systematic archaeological study of North American indigenous cultures. Its mandate included the excavation, collection, and cataloging of artifacts and human remains from burial sites across the continent. A mandate that, by the standards of 21st century archaeological ethics, was conducted in ways that would not be permissible today and that generated significant and documented harm to indigenous communities whose ancestral remains were removed without consent. The accession ledger was the Bureau's primary administrative instrument. Every object received by the Smithsonian was supposed to generate an accession entry, a record of what arrived, from whom, when, and under what circumstances. The ledgers for the Bureau of American Ethnology during the 1880s and 1890s are in the Smithsonian Institution archives. They are accessible to researchers. They have been examined by historians of American archaeology. They are not complete. The incompleteness of 19th century institutional accession records is not unusual. Archives of this period routinely contain gaps: objects received informally, donations processed without full documentation, field collections that arrived faster than the administrative system could record them. The Bureau of American Ethnology was, by the accounts of its own staff correspondents, chronically understaffed and overwhelmed by the volume of material arriving from field agents across the continent. This is the context in which the newspaper report question has to be evaluated. The newspaper accounts themselves are the first documentary layer. The reports that circulated between 1880 and 1910 describing unusually large skeletal remains share certain consistent features. They appear in local papers rather than scientific journals. They describe the finds in sensational terms. They frequently reference unnamed witnesses or unnamed recipients at the Smithsonian, and they almost never include the kind of specific detail: precise measurements, named excavators, specific accession numbers that would make independent verification possible. This is not evidence that the finds did not occur. Unusual skeletal finds were genuinely common in the agricultural Midwest during this period, as plowing and drainage work disturbed pre-Columbian burial sites with regularity. The Bureau of American Ethnology received skeletal material from across the country through exactly the informal channels that local newspaper accounts describe. Irreach, and here is where the bridge of relevance matters. Because the experience of reading an institutional archive and finding that the record does not contain what you expected to find is not automatically evidence of suppression. It is, more commonly, evidence of the ordinary incompleteness of 19th century administrative practice. The question is not whether gaps exist. Gaps exist in every archive of this period. The question is whether these specific gaps follow a pattern that ordinary incompleteness cannot explain. Maybe the 17 newspaper accounts that reference Smithsonian disposition of large skeletal remains simply describe donations that were received, processed informally, and cataloged under descriptions that do not match the newspaper's terminology, or that were accessioned under broader categories that do not distinguish them from the general skeletal collection. If this were the whole picture, the absence of specific accession entries would be a documentation problem, not a suppression problem. But the record raises a more specific question than that. The Bureau of American Ethnology's own correspondence files, the letters between field agents and Washington, the donation acknowledgments, the collection requests, are in the archive alongside the accession ledgers. For many objects whose accession entries are thin or absent, the correspondence file contains the paper trail that the ledger lacks: a letter acknowledging receipt, a field agent's note describing the material, a curator's assessment of its research value. For the 17 newspaper-referenced cases that historians have attempted to trace through the correspondence files, the correspondence is not uniformly present either. Archival patterns suggest the gap is not random. The cases where both the ledger entry and the correspondence file are absent are not evenly distributed across the Bureau's operational period. They cluster in specific years and specific geographic regions, years of high excavation activity, regions where the Bureau's field presence was most active. That is not proof of suppression. It is a pattern that the ordinary incompleteness explanation does not fully account for. The Cyrus Thomas report is where the documentary record becomes most useful and, most honestly, complicated. Cyrus Thomas was the Bureau of American Ethnology's principal investigator for mound archaeology from 1882 to 1894. His 12-year survey of mound sites across the eastern United States produced the Bureau's most comprehensive archaeological report of the period, a 730-page document published in 1894 that cataloged hundreds of excavation sites, described thousands of objects, and attempted to resolve the question of who had built the mounds that had puzzled European American observers since colonial times. The Thomas report is in the archive. It is fully accessible. It has been read by archaeologists for over a century. What it contains, in its descriptions of skeletal material recovered from mound excavations, is specific and verifiable. Accounts of remains that Thomas and his field agents described as larger than average, in several cases significantly larger, recovered from burial contexts that indicated high-status interment. Thomas noted these dimensions in his field reports. He included them in his published summary. He did not conclude that they represented a race of giants. He concluded that they represented individual variation within the populations that had built the mounds, the same populations that the Thomas report's central argument identified, correctly by the consensus of subsequent archaeological scholarship, as the ancestors of historic Native American peoples. The Thomas report's skeletal descriptions are the documentary foundation that the giant bones narrative has consistently misread. The misreading works like this. A field report describes remains as larger than average. The newspaper covering the excavation describes them as giant. The Smithsonian receives the newspaper account, sometimes before, sometimes after receiving the actual material. The accession entry, when it exists, describes the material in Thomas's technical language, not the newspaper's sensational language. A researcher looking for the newspaper's giants in the accession ledger does not find them, because the ledger uses different terminology for the same objects. This is not suppression. It is the gap between journalistic and scientific description of the same physical reality. The giants the newspapers described are in the ledger. They are just not called giants. And then there is the question that the Thomas report cannot answer, and that the archive, honestly examined, cannot answer either. The Bureau of American Ethnology's skeletal collections were subject to a repatriation process beginning with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990. NAGPRA required federal agencies and federally funded institutions to inventory their holdings of Native American human remains and associated funerary objects, consult with affiliated tribes, and return materials to lineal descendants and culturally affiliated communities. The Smithsonian's repatriation process under NAGPRA generated its own documentary record, inventory reports, tribal consultation records, repatriation agreements. That record is not fully public. Portions are withheld under provisions that protect the privacy of tribal consultation processes. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different institutional archive, one where the gap between what the record contains and what the record describes is specific enough to ask a question the official history has not answered. What the NAGPRA record's partial inaccessibility means for the giant bones question is not what the conspiracy theory claims. It does not mean the Smithsonian is hiding evidence of giants behind repatriation paperwork. What it means is that the complete inventory of what the Bureau of American Ethnology's skeletal collection contained before repatriation began is not fully reconstructible from the public record. The accession ledgers are incomplete. The correspondence files have gaps. The NAGPRA inventory is partially withheld, and the newspaper accounts describe objects in language that the scientific record does not use. None of this proves suppression. What it proves is that the archive was never designed to answer the question the newspapers asked. And the question the archive can answer is more uncomfortable than the giant story. The more uncomfortable question is the one the giant bones narrative has consistently obscured. The Bureau of American Ethnology removed human remains from thousands of indigenous burial sites across North America between 1879 and the early 20th century. It did so without the consent of the communities whose ancestors those remains represented. It cataloged them, studied them, stored them, and in some cases lost track of them in the administrative gaps that the accession ledgers document. The communities whose ancestors were taken have spent decades navigating a repatriation process that requires them to prove cultural affiliation to an institution that holds the only records that are, in documented cases, incomplete. The giant bones narrative looks at those incomplete records and asks, where are the giants the newspapers described? The answer the archive provides is that the newspapers described ordinary human variation in extraordinary language, and that the institutional record used different language for the same objects. But the question the archive is actually sitting with, the one that the repatriation process makes visible, is not about giants. It is about who had the authority to remove those remains in the first place, who bore the cost of their removal, and whether the documentary gaps in the accession ledgers represent administrative incompleteness or something the institution chose not to record. The ledger goes silent on 17 entries. The silence is not about giants. The archive contains what it was built to contain. The question is who decided what that would be?